A thought here is this expression, one-stop shopping has come up, and we like to use the expression one-shop stopping, which is kind of what this process has become. How do we go back to the original vision? We'd hoped that Karen Ray would be here today to do a brief presentation about the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York, which I'd like to suggest could become a model, and basically it was using the existing legal and regulatory framework of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, State of New York, and they're moving ahead with a new 3-mile long, 8-lane bridge across the Hudson River. 11 months from start of process to record of decision. Again, it was on the president's dashboard list of 14 projects that were given expedited, highlighted staffing and so forth. The projects of national significance, and simultaneous permitting, procurement, preliminary design, project labor agreement, public process, and so forth, so that within a year of the start of the initiation of the project, a contract was signed and the project was under construction. Now that's with the existing regulations and the existing procedures under NEPA. The question is, can we, I like to describe it as kind of a happy accident of a very determined governor, a cooperative US DOT agency process. Could we go from that being the exception to the rule, or do we need to tip over the whole bathtub and tip the baby out and start over again? Which, as I said to Phil, just right after we get through immigration reform, the budget, and the sequester, and a few other things, the Congress might get around to it. But so the question is, how can we focus in on the changes that need to be made? Can we move to an expedited but still effective environmental review process? Do we need legislation? Can we do it through a regulatory, through an executive order, regulatory changes? We have a very distinguished group here. Tyler Duvall, former Assistant Secretary at US DOT, so he's been on both sides now at McKinsey. George Frampton, former counsel at Council of Environmental Quality, now at Yale. Nick Malyshev, we just heard from. Diana Mendes, we just heard from, and Phil Howard, of course, who we have heard from and we'll hear more from. So why don't we start with Tyler? And Tyler, you helped administer this process at a major federal agency. Can we
unsuccessfully?
Well, can we put the genie back in the bottle?
Yeah. So first of all, the senator's comments were probably the most heartwarming, optimistic thing. I generally have grown from being a naive optimist to a realistic optimist to a huge pessimist in this area. But listening to the senator talk, and he's a University of Virginia law school grad, which is good, which is where I went. I actually feel if we can start to get some thoughtful people, particularly in the Senate, to start talking about the kind of nature of this problem differently, I think there's hope on the horizon. I think also, obviously, seeing people like Darren and others from the environmental community kind of embrace the need for reform, I think is also a key. As long as we start to agree on the problem statement, I think one of the big challenges is we don't have full consensus on what the problem is. And I think, when we look at this, I ran that kind of national effort that the Bush administration did to prioritize. We had an environmental streamlining stewardship executive order that President Bush issued. It was, looking back now with some experience on this problem, I think we basically did it a little bit half-baked. So we picked, I think it was a great idea. I think we ultimately focused too much on the projects, not on the structural problems that were creating those problems around those projects. So we picked 10 projects. We said they were high priorities. That's critical. That's part of the process, is decide what you care about. But the approach we took was to just kind of aggressively, relentlessly oversee those projects. I think that's part of it, but I think you'll constantly be chasing your tail if that's all you do. I think there's some structural, fundamental problems, obviously. And the way we think about it at McKinsey are there strategic problems, there are operational problems, and there are organizational ones. I think the operational ones are actually the easiest. So within the current legislative and regulatory framework, I think there's a lot that we can do now to basically just speed up processes. One thing that we look at, though, is, I think countries start to immediately go to their biggest, hairiest, most problematic projects. I actually think there are a lot of techniques and tools. You see it with private entities that we work with around the world to deploy lean processes, which include, changes in mindsets and behaviors. So there's a lot of cultural elements to this. But you look at, effectively the innovation that Toyota introduced to the world that is now literally penetrating every single industrial entity. Every retailer around the world is using this approach called lean. And I think this experiment, or this new management approach, which we, it's boring, but it works. We can talk in great detail about. I think we can start to use actually on some of our simpler projects, because I think there needs to build up some confidence. So if you could basically take the time frame of a relatively simple EA or something, take a project that would otherwise take 12 months or 9 months and reduce that to 6 or 7, that's a dramatic improvement in terms of percentages. And that will build some confidence that these tools and the processes actually work. So I think one idea we've talked to governments around is don't just take the worst of the worst, the ones that are the most controversial, but start to introduce operational changes on the easiest projects, the ones that we should just do and do well. The other thing I think we took, when I was in the government, we took a group over to Australia, actually. It was great to hear the comments, actually, around the OECD. It is clear that Canada, the UK, and Australia is doing it better. I think that's just, they're reaching better decisions environmentally in some ways, and they're pursuing projects more innovatively. I just think overall their strategy is better. The nature of the question, though, was fascinating to me. So in the U.S., obviously NEPA, we talked a lot about NEPA. NEPA obviously is a disclosure document, a process. It's not really intended, or never was intended, to be just purely a decision process. It was intended, and rightfully, in response to a lot of really bad projects getting through the pipeline. So I think at the time it was probably the right thing to do. But the nature of the question in Australia was fascinating. We talked about this major port project they were doing. I think this was in 2007. And, we talked, this would have taken literally 15 years in the United States, this project. Complex dredging, huge environmental impacts, major need. And, we kind of asked them how long it took. And basically they said, well, the Environmental Resource Agency, cleared the project in 6 months or something like that. And we were very confused about that. And basically the question that they were answering in that process, which is something that Marvin Bower, who's the legend at McKinsey, used to always say, look, it's really about the question. It's really not about the answer. And the question they were asking is, how do we mitigate the impacts of this project that we as a society have already determined is an extremely cost-beneficial thing to do? And then that's a very simple conversation. There are lots of ways you can deploy the best and brightest in the world in the United States to mitigate impacts of projects that we agree on the front end. So I think in the U.S. we've got projects that are very half-baked, poorly conceived, getting into the pipeline, and then obviously you imagine a snake that's eating too much. Just clogging up the pipeline in a very, very inefficient way. So we let too many bad projects go in on the front end, but we also are not giving enough weight and authority to the projects that are really good. So projects that clear a benefit cost test, whatever you want to use it at, by significant margins under any scenario. So take the worst environmental impact scenario you could take and run the analysis, monetize the costs, monetize the benefits in very sophisticated ways, which we can do now. The data is so much better to be able to do that. Those should be treated differently than other projects, and there should be a weight given to the fact, and there is some anecdotal evidence, others in the room know more than I, that projects with high benefit cost ratios actually do have a shorter time period under the environmental process. But that's really not systematic. And I think in the U.S., if we can really on the front end start to have a much more discipline that buys us obviously speed on the back end, I think that's something to think about. And then the last thing I'll just say, and we can kind of answer questions, and I do think there's something around performance and certainty, transparency and certainty. Obviously the Obama administration has put up this dashboard, which I think is great. The reality is, we can go further. I think we can have more granular data about where these projects are. I know there's uneasiness on the executive branch side to kind of letting everybody into every detail of work that's going on, and there's a lot of back and forth negotiation. But the truth is, it just should be clear about what the questions that the executive branch is wrestling with. Where are they in the analysis around those questions? Is there additional information they need? I just think overall, it's just still not anywhere near as transparent. And then, I do think this one-stop shop idea obviously has a lot of momentum. I agree with the comment, though. I would. About the difficulty of consolidating agencies. I would not, candidly have a huge war to kind of strip agencies of power to consolidate. I think the reality is on the strategic and operational front, we can do a lot now. Ultimately, organizational solutions, I think, can work. We can have specific, we call them delivery units. We worked actually in Malaysia with the government to create a delivery unit, which basically is looking across all of the government. Those kinds of things make sense, but I don't think, a huge stripping of agency power. I think that will take 25 years and probably accomplish pretty little.
Words of wisdom from a man who's been there, right? So, George.
Is this operating?
Yep.
I don't know whether NEPA as a statute is broken, although it's clear that the way we administer it often is broken. But I don't foresee any real likelihood of a major statutory reform, restructuring of NEPA. So perhaps around the edges, MAP 21's attempt to squash the final EIS and a record of decision, which can be a year process, into one, is a good example. You know, maybe there is a possibility for some legislative reforms around the edges, but I think what we're stuck with then is trying to figure out how to regulatory and procedural changes, management changes that manage the NEPA process better. In my experience, the 2 points at which there's a critical need for senior management attention is the beginning and the end, not so much in the middle. And I was struck by a conversation that I had with Diana and your presentation about how, to a large extent, these analyses, even huge analyses on huge projects, are done sort of in the bowels of the agency. Somebody else who's an expert in this is paying attention to it. And I think that's a major problem and a point that needs to be fixed. Because what the choke points here are really at the beginning and the end. At the beginning, there needs to be really senior management attention and accountability in an agency to the plan for doing a major EIS. So it's not just what's called the purpose and need, which is a statutory shibboleth. What is the scope of the analysis going to be? What are the major impacts that are going to be covered? To what depth are they going to be covered? What are the alternatives? Because that's a huge problem that often changes in the middle. What are the alternatives that are going to be considered? In the cumulative effects, cumulative impacts analysis, how cumulative are you going to be? Those are key decisions, and they're very often not made at all or not made correctly at the beginning, which costs you years in the process downstream. And then the other choke point is the end, because so often as the process nears the end, people start revisiting decisions that are made at the beginning. Then the document's finished. Then you may spend 9 months where it goes upstairs from level to level in the agency, or if there are multiple agencies across agencies. Then you have a final EIS, and you can have up to another year to rewrite the conclusion of the EIS as a record of decision with another public review process. So if you had a decision-making process in an agency required that senior people signed off at the beginning and then at the end, near the end, so when it's about done, it gets done. You don't waste another year and a half in what should be a 2 or 3 month process. The only other checkpoint or choke point many of these analyses is when the project changes, partly as a result of the environmental impact. So the solar developer sees that he's not going to get a 600 megawatt project permitted, and in the middle it turns into a 250 megawatt project, or it shifts to avoid an endangered species or an impact on water or something like that. So there's the third need, where you have to have a senior accountability in the agency. That kind of management structure doesn't occur at many places, certainly not in my experience. And that, it seems to me, is the single biggest management change that might make a real difference. Just to give you a quick example of a problem that's currently actually bedeviling the administration, shows you how important it is to make these decisions at the front end. In fact, this is a problem that's probably holding up for a year or more CEQ's release of guidance on how to take account of climate change in NEPA, which seems, a fairly self-evident need, but that guidance has been hung up for years. And I think the reason the guidance is hung up is the following. the Army Corps of Engineers has some proposals to expand docking facilities on the West Coast to allow coal exports. So these are shipping piers that are going to be expanded to accommodate coal that's brought down by train or barge through the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area, in large part, and shipped to China. So the Army Corps of Engineers gets a permit, clean 404 permit application, that says we want to triple the size of this dock. Okay, what's the scope of that review? Well, it could be there's some mussels there could be some sedimentation, maybe there's some fish, right? Ships are going to come in to the dock. You're going to have to take account of what the impact is from the shipping coming to the dock. Is that the scope of the permit? Or is the scope of the permit the air and other impacts on shipping coal from Montana and Wyoming through the Columbia River Gorge in barges or in railroad cars? Well, yes, that's probably part of the... Now, there are 7 or 8 applications for docks. So do you have to do an analysis of what 7 of these are going to do, or only 1? What's the cumulative impact? And, of course, the environmental community is pushing very hard for an analysis of what this is going to do to global greenhouse emissions when the Chinese burn all this coal over 30 years. So do you have to do an analysis of the future of the Chinese coal industry to determine whether this dock should be pushed out 100 feet or not? Those are the kinds of decisions that often have to be made up front, and they either don't get made or they get made in a way that's later determined to be probably the wrong decision. Now, one final note about this. The issues that relate to environmental impact statements are often not just NEPA issues, but they're issues that interrelate with the permitting and NEPA. So a very good example of a problem that arose is that during the Bush administration, for years, the Interior Department was developing regulations for offshore wind facilities. There were no regulations for offshore wind facilities. The Obama administration came in and said, oh, this is a real priority, let's get these things out. They were largely written. Obama administration pushed, Secretary pushed, get these regulations out so we can begin to permit offshore wind farms. The problem was nobody ever really talked to anyone who built an offshore wind farm in Europe, right? I mean, there's a lot of experience here, but that experience wasn't reflected in the regulations. So as soon as the regulations came out, the wind companies who were moving forward said, well, gee, you've written regulations that require us to write an environmental impact statement to do the studies, to develop the information that are necessary to do an environmental impact statement to build the project. So it looks like we have to do first an EA for Met towers, then we have to do 2 sequential EISs. So that's about 9 to 11 years to build an offshore wind farm, because we have to do 2 EISs that are basically identical, one after the other. That's not a NEPA problem, that's a permitting problem. And very often in the case of big renewable energy projects that have been permitted over the last 4 years, it's the interaction between, in many cases, the Endangered Species Act permitting requirements and the NEPA requirements that don't fit. That's a problem that has to be addressed at the beginning of an EIS as well, but it means the permitting agency, the regulatory agency, or one of the regulatory agencies has a set of requirements that are going to make NEPA very difficult to apply in an efficient way. And so that's a problem that has to be addressed as a partnership between the permitting agency and the NEPA compliance people. It's not always just about NEPA, it's about the interrelationship between the permitting and the environmental analysis.
Great. Thank you. Great. So 2 conclusions. 1, life is complicated. And 2, my God, we're trying to set global environmental policy around an EIS over a dock on the Columbia River, which sounds like an incongruous kind of thing to do. But okay. So why don't we go to Nick and then Diana, and then we'll have Phil close out with his comments, and then we'll get a conversation going among ourselves and with the audience. So take it,
Thanks.
Nick.
I really don't have too much to say. I felt like I took up too much time on the podium. But just to pick up on what some of the other panelists have said, in terms of trying to fix the system, again, knowing why you want to fix it is pretty important. Is the problem, part of is the problem with the tool, the assessment tool itself? Do you need to change the process in terms of how you do the evaluations? I mean, that's usually the easiest way to fix it, but it usually has the least durable results. I mean, oftentimes, you probably need to think a little bit more about the institutions, about who's doing it and why. I mean, certainly, in what I've seen in other policy areas and in other countries is that impact assessments are done after a decision's been made. I mean, it's a real box-ticking exercise. It's not done far enough upstream to really inform the analysis. It's just kind of like, okay, we've made the decision. Now here's the justification. I mean, that's absolutely, it doesn't serve a purpose at all there. But that, addressing that is really trying to change the culture of bureaucrats, which is always, hard to do. I mean, one way to do that, or at least one thing to help, is some of the issues that you mentioned about oversight. Like, who's ultimately then going to sign off on this sort of pre-made decision? I mean, again, if there's, if it's a ministerial decision, it has to clear some kind of intergovernmental decision. That then will require, a rigor of analysis is probably greater than you would get otherwise. So again, some of these cabinet-led processes that you see in the UK in particular have been really fundamentally important in terms of improving the whole impact assessment process. So it wasn't so much looking at the tool itself, but looking at the governance and the oversight, which led to better changes. Thanks.
Okay. Diana?
I will also be brief, as I used up a lot of time on the podium, but three thoughts building on what we've discussed here this morning. One is we need to figure out a way to incentivize good behavior. And that means upfront articulating what the expectations are and then creating some streamlined processes so that those projects that have achieved that consensus and have met certain thresholds of expectation actually get some sort of expedited review process. Because the way it works now, it doesn't matter whether you've incorporated a lot of views or not, you're still going through the full process because we're measured on whether or not we did the process, not what the actual content or outcome is of the project. And an interesting study in that was on Lower Manhattan. We changed the question, to get to your point, of how do we make the rebuilding work. And instead of going through the standard impact assessment and then figuring out mitigation, we said, what are the environmental performance commitments that need to be incorporated right into the design of the project? And that changed the whole public debate because suddenly people weren't arguing about the data sources and the way you did the impact assessment and whether or not you had enough meetings and who heard about it. Suddenly those environmental performance commitments were things that the constituencies wanted to see get done, and the only way to get them done was to get the project completed. So completely different type of public discussion, as well as an extremely short time frame in terms of completing environmental review. The second element is clarifying the federal role. It's hard to be a partner and a cop, and I don't think it's clear in a lot of environmental review what role the federal agencies are playing, because are they checking on what people do, or are they trying to advance good, sound public policy decisions and needed investment? And then thirdly, the point of looking at the whole framework, to your point about it's not just a NEPA issue or environmental review, it also relates to the permitting. Remember, when NEPA was enacted, it was the first. There weren't all the other federal environmental laws. There weren't all the state programs. Most of the permitting we know today didn't exist, right? So the field has been filled behind NEPA, and we haven't really looked at that entire framework to analyze where the redundancies are, much to your point, Nick. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Phil, clean up ball.
Great. Well, I'm going to go up to even up to a higher level of abstraction. What I write about, and I have a book coming out about this, my fourth book, is is the nature of legal structures and human behavior. And we have this myth in our society that if we make law clear enough and processes long enough, that a correct decision will emerge. All it does is hide the decision maker. Law has a very hard time making a decision, and when it tries to make a decision, it is almost always the wrong decision because circumstances have changed. I could give 1,000 examples of that. So what's happened, it seems to me, with NEPA is that it has gone into a black box. We don't really know who's in control. People are motivated by this abstract fear, as Diana said, of litigation. There are whole industries of people who do this over years now, including my colleagues here like George and Don Elliott. We make money on it too. But it's based on a myth. And the myth is that somehow the correct decision will emerge out of the process. The process should inform a correct decision. And so in that sense, I think it's a really important, whether it's NEPA or some other statute, it's a really important status to take a pause, to look at the facts, for people to know what the impacts are going to be, and then make a politically accountable decision. One thing that that struck me about the presentation so far is that is the difference between environmental policy and strategic plans on the one hand, and environmental review for a particular project on the other hand. I don't think we have clearly clarified those distinctions. As Bob said, it's madness to argue about China's burning of coal and a permit for a dock. But it's not madness to argue about China's burning of coal. That's just not the right place for it. That's a question of really important global policy. And I, for one, don't think the U.S. is doing a very good job of environmental policy. We have no moral standing to argue about anybody else's anything. But so environmental policy and strategic planning need to be located somewhere else, and they should have their own environmental arguments. I mean, we don't have much planning. Bob's not-for-profit or NGO is the main planning body for the largest metropolitan area of the United States. It's not even part of government. It's the only part of government that actually plans. RPA has planned where the tunnels go and the bridges go and everything else, and it's incredibly effective. But we need to separate that, it seems I've learned today, from analysis of mitigation and alternatives. And when you get down to points of mitigation and alternatives, it seems to me the most important innovation, and George Frampton talked about it, is the idea of having a decision maker who people know, they can look at. I don't know where that decision maker is housed, but that decision maker can say, okay, I see you're just raising the roadway or the bridge, you're not changing anything else. I think what you should review is this, that, and the other. Let them go forth, and that decision maker is there, and the proponent can go back to them, the lead agency or whoever it is, and say, well, here's what we have so far. Do you think that's enough? Do an analysis and have a 28-day time frame like they have in the UK or something. And then they'll say either yes or no. And this being America, nobody will accept any of those decisions. So they'll sue. That's fine. Let them sue, but let them sue with Chevron deference about whether those decisions were clearly unreasonable, and let them sue after 1 year instead of 10 years. Well, that's advanced the ball, and I'm thinking of the Bayonne Bridge now, which is only 5 years into its process. That would have advanced the ball by 4 years in that particular project. Just having a decision maker who can say, okay, yeah, that seems like what you ought to go for, and then at the end, that seems good enough to me. The politically accountable people should go and make a decision. So it's not making the ultimate decision. I don't know if we can do it administratively or not, George, and I take your point about the complete paralysis at Capitol Hill, which I live in New York, so I think it's all the problem of the people in this room. But it's a cultural problem. It's sort of the deviant subculture of Washington. But but I think those areas, separating larger environmental goals and strategy and policy from mitigation and alternative type and effects type analysis, and having a decision maker, are two, I think, important takeaways for me, at least, of this panel.
Other comments, or George? You want to come back
Let
on
me
that?
just say, I think in your myth department is the
Grab the mic, George.
Sorry, the widespread belief that, as several people have said, that NEPA is designed to be a decision-making process as opposed to an information process. So, when a project is facing endangered species, listed species impacts, the formula is that you're supposed to do everything you can to avoid an impact on the species. What's unavoidable you minimize, and then what's left after you minimize the impact you have to mitigate for. And I think that there's a belief that NEPA is designed, that the whole environmental assessment process is designed to make sure that the decision maker chooses the course of action that avoids, minimizes, and mitigates all environmental impacts to the greatest extent possible. And if the preferred alternative doesn't do that, then there was something wrong with not having chosen an alternative that was a smaller impact. Indeed, the no action alternative is usually the smallest impact. So if that rule were really the driving force of NEPA, then you would always decide not to go ahead.
It's
the
interesting.
project.
Interesting
That
to
is
me.
that is a widely misunderstood, I think, publicly and even in the government, misunderstanding of what the whole purpose of NEPA is about.
Yeah, maybe we need to get Bill Clinton on this thing as the explainer. Remember the guy that was or somebody like him to explain what this thing is really designed to do and what it's not designed to do. It's interesting. You go back in history, that right about the time that the National Environmental Policy Act, was enacted by the Congress. Henry Jackson was trying to get a National Planning Act that was going to require, or create incentives for the states to create what the rest of the world calls strategic plans, the kind of things that you described for. Others have described for Singapore and Malaysia. The rest of the world does these things, and actually has national and state or provincial infrastructure plans. And as part of the plans, you go through the process of figuring out what the alternatives are, and that's a planning decision that gets made. And only then, once the plan is completed, do you actually do an evaluation of the more detailed environmental impacts that the project might have. I reminded on the TAP-NZ where we had our 11-month record of decision, and in the process. And one of the other things that's changed is that when NEPA was passed, the area of environmental information and geospatial information, there wasn't any. We didn't have any information about what the resources were, and so this process was designed to create an opportunity to find the facts and collect the facts and then make them available. Well, when we went into the TAP-NZ, between the fine work of the Nature Conservancy and the state DEC and others, we knew we had a name for every Atlantic sturgeon that was going to be affected by this thing, and we had at least one environmental advocate for every one of those sturgeon, and we knew that the project had to be designed in a way that minimized impacts on sturgeon, that minimized dredging, that made sure that the dredging that did happen had the minimal impact on breeding habitat. I mean, the pile driving and dredging only happens in a limited a period of time, during the year when they're not spawning and so forth. And they're on the dredging barge. I learned yesterday that at 24 hours a day, there are marine biologists who are on the barge. That in the event that a sturgeon comes up onto the barge,
Do you have a second job
What's that? No, what's that?
on the barge?
Well, I'm thinking about it, but there's, they're basically empowered to do, I guess what amounts to mouth-to-mouth resuscitation with each of these fish, and so forth. So the abbreviated process, for this project, something that ordinarily would have taken 7-8 years or never, really, and it really is getting to know. That's the problem. That it was used to create a very effective process for mitigating the impacts on the known, environmental resources, dealing with the problem, engaging the advocates so they were part of the process, making those decisions and so forth. And that's what we need to build into every one of these things. Now, what it requires is a commitment of staffing. It means that the resource agencies have to have people who are on board. It requires that somebody's in charge of the process, creates a critical path at the beginning. And I think this business of setting deadlines is really important. We shouldn't just have, the problem with the dashboard, there are no deadlines in the dashboard, right? We said we'll expedite it, but the Bayonne Bridge, and some of these are still not through the process years later. But creating a critical path, having assigned leaders in the federal, lead agency, in the resource agencies, and whoever, and then the proponents having somebody's in charge of the whole process it seems to be one of the keys to this whole thing. And then it's just having a timeline and a leader. It's having a weekly consultation among the principals over whether they're on schedule or not, and if they're not on schedule, what has to be done to get it back on schedule. And what I just described happen on one project and not on the thousands. And so how do we, and by the way, that would be very, very expensive to make the staffing commitment, at all of these agencies to do it. But then what's it costing us to build in years of delay, or as the senator said, to have projects that never happen at all because we're afraid of the regulatory process. Comments, thoughts on all of that? Tyler?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, if you had an economist kind of stepping back as opposed to a bunch of lawyers kind of looking at this problem, they would actually be kind of excited because I think the deadweight loss associated with the costs, that have been talked about are precisely what you can use to basically enter agreements much more quickly and get better environmental outcomes. The problem is we don't have a forum to effectively divvy up the savings associated with reducing that deadweight loss from the delays. And one of the things we did put out a proposal at the end of the last administration. They would and maybe this isn't the right forum, but create the equivalent of there's in the regulatory front, if you could talk about, NPRMs and things like that, there's a RegNeg process, a regulatory, basically a negotiated rulemaking process that is designed to get stakeholders around a table. It's not binding, but one thing you could do is effectively create some mechanism. Obviously, if the parties can't agree, you can always kind of run NEPA through its normal course. And I think some of these process improvements and governance things are just no regrets moves. We should just do them. We should do them now. We should experiment. We should document the experiments. I would start a little small, just because I think you do need to build momentum. But I think the deadweight losses are massive. And if you're looking at particularly input costs of some of these projects going up 8 to 10% year over year, you shave 4 to 5 years off the decision. That's a lot of money that can be divvied up to the community groups, environmental groups, the sponsors of the projects, and everybody. Then there is a win-win in this scenario. That actually is always the reason I'm like, this is fixable because of that. But again, we haven't done it.
Can I just say, bringing people together always sounds good, but whoever doesn't like what's going on, and Don Elliott's written about this, will game the system to their own benefit. So having negotiating rulemaking stuff is a great idea only if you have a decision maker.
Right.
It's only when there's a judge sitting up there who can pound the gavel and say, no, you're being unreasonable, will people be reasonable. And if they don't have the judge there, somebody's going to draw the line. Somebody's going to game the system. And it's just the nature of institutional dynamics. Has been studied by a lot of people.
No, you're absolutely right about that. But take the Intercounty Connector, which is one of our kind of fast-track projects in the last administration. The environmental community for a lot of legitimate reasons, opposed that project, largest new highway construction in the region, for years. I mean, and Susan knows this better than anybody. I mean, this was 30 years in concept. The governor of Maryland, basically, to your point about decision makers, said, we're going to do it. Now, whether you agree with the project or not, there's a huge amount of loss associated with the delay that could have been spread among it. And the project is open. It's built. So if you're the environmental community, the problem you've got is the main tool is delay. You actually don't have necessarily a mechanism to divvy up the savings.
Right. It's interesting. Nobody's talked about what the opportunity cost here, except in general terms. But McKinsey, among others, has done studies that showed if we had a streamlined environmental process, we could employ close to 2 million people in the next few years. The capital is not going to be hard to access. The studies show that the return on investment for the infrastructure, which America's infrastructure now, I think, has a D+ rating by the Society of Civil Engineers, something like that.
Moved up a little bit.
Yeah. The return from D to D+, go America.
Right.
The return on capital is like 70%. I mean, we're talking about, Nick referred to it generally, but it's unbelievably profitable enterprise, and really would engage the economy in every way.
So if we were to take a small piece of that and make a solemn commitment to beef up the staffing and the resource agencies and the Army Corps of Engineers and the others, just to say, let's take the current busted system, but let's make sure let's get it on it's like getting on a diet. Let's get it on a schedule. Let's have assigned staff. Let's take and I go back to what Diana said, is that this is obviously NEPA wasn't designed to work with the internet, so we still have resource agencies doing consecutive reviews and then popping their comments that I think have been written with quill pens still. Some of them some of them use ballpoint pens, but then they pop in an envelope and go down to the post office and they mail it to the next resource agency. So automate the process so that the whole thing is online. Simultaneous reviews by agencies, again, weekly check-ins so that everybody understands, where they are and what the reason for delay might be, and then you do something about it. And one thing to do, perhaps by statute or by regulation, would be to attach some deadlines to these things. That seems like a reasonable thing to do, and a standard that we are going to complete a review within. Let's decide. Let's be ambitious and say 1 year, maybe less ambitious and say 2 years for very complex projects and so forth. That would be a fabulous improvement over 77 months, which is what we have now.
And longer for big projects.
So we have smart people in the audience here who have been listening to us drone on, and would anybody like to do we have a microphone that we're going to take around? Yeah. Okay, why don't we start over here? And just tell us who you are, please, and a brief comment. No seventh panelist, please.
No problem. I'm Patrick Sable, the Brookings Institution. Senator King really underlined how paralyzed the federal government is right now, and particularly Congress. What could states or localities do on these issues to innovate or try to push things forward on their own? And the only example I could really think of is the Western Governors Association with their chat initiative, where they're aggregating all these environmental impact studies into a single database that people can use. But are there other innovations that could be pushed out that could accelerate these projects get done, again, at the state and local level?
Well, the problem is NEPA, right? It's a national act, and if there's federal money or a federal regulatory decision involved, the feds are of necessity in the picture, I think. And so I'm not sure the states can fix this on their own. But other comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, California and now Texas have assumed responsibility for NEPA reviews that the USDOT had. And I'd love to hear. The jury's out, I think, as to how much time that saved. But clearly, you minimize some of the passback with the Fed. So yeah, I do think the sophisticated states have more than enough capability to assume a lot of these responsibilities. So that's one thing. I think the other thing you're going to start to see, though, talking to a lot of states, is they're going to start to segment their projects. And the hook on a lot of this, you're right, there are specific permits, Clean Water Act. But a lot of the, if you're just taking federal money in certain cases for new development, you talk to like Utah DOT, for instance, and they're like, we're not going to use federal money for any new capacity project. So the irony is that I do think the inefficiency of this process will effectively drive states to outcomes that is precisely the opposite of what a lot of the environmental community wants, which is, we're going to effectively use our own processes. And, now because the law has been, the federal process has been so dominant, it's not like any state is off doing some kind of random thing that has no connection. But I think you'll see more and more states effectively adopt their own. And the other thing I would say is all these kind of process improvements we're talking about, states are doing them. I think Iowa's done some of it. I think Minnesota's done some of it. I mean, there's probably 15 examples we can talk about. But I would just unleash all of that across the U.S. And frankly, I would have the federal government supporting it, financially, operationally. The field offices of all the interior transportation should be basically helping them design different processes. Instead, it is not a kind of particularly collaborative relationship in a lot of cases.
The next panel is going to talk about this, but there's a problem of balkanization. Savannah Rivers, in its 14th year of federal NEPA review, and Georgia and South Carolina are, in only a semi-coordinated way, doing their own reviews, which are not finished yet. Does that make any sense? No. So Professor Jim McIntyre's here has been helping us understand how some of the countries on the continent do this. And in Germany, for example, the law is quite clear that there is a lead agency, and that agency makes the final decision. It has an obligation to coordinate with other agencies, and then what that agency is depends on the nature of the project. So if it's a primarily internal state project, the state will be given responsibility, and the federal government can give its views, but the state is making the decision. So it's not a second bite at the apple federally. If it's a federal project or a national project, the federal government has responsibility, and the state can feed its comments, but it is not doing its own review. And to give two examples, I was just hunting around for examples the other day. A large platform in the North Sea, more than, I forget how many miles offshore, a connector platform, took 20 months for approval. In Germany, that was a federal approval. I think the one I'm about to mention is a state approval. I'm not positive. The Leipzig Tunnel, a huge construction project with lots of complications, took 18 months for the approval process. They've had trouble financing and other things, so it's just getting done. That was like 10 years ago. But it was an 18-month process where they looked at it. They have judicial review. They have, it's very transparent. But it's really important, I think, and it's not even part of the discussion now, to avoid overlapping jurisdictions. And we have paralysis by federalism in this country that various people have referred to, where you just get, okay, now it's this county's turn, as Governor King said, to have 30 meetings about whether the power line that already goes through the county can get a new updated line on it. Well, that's completely absurd. And you just have to, basically deny those localities that authority. It's a political problem, but it's a bigger national problem.
Other comments, questions? Susan, right over here.
So the comment was, what are counties, locals, other than the feds doing? And I'll just use this as a point to say that Orange County, California, Orange County Transportation Authority, not a state, a county. Now, of course, the scale is a little different. They run roads and toll roads and buses and everything else, but they got so frustrated by this situation as a secondary grantee, a secondary recipient, that they actually commissioned us to go through and do the list of comprehensive recommendations. And I'm just thrilled with the kind of discussion here, because I think we hit so many of them. But one that is the elephant in the room that has not been mentioned, and that's why I'll take the chance, is to say that the problem is rooted in a lack of trust. Trust in the government, trust in the communication with interest groups. So you substitute feet of paper, not even inches, but feet of documentation for that trust. And this idea that you collaborate in advance and you bring people together is great, but you need the elevation so that you have the decision maker. You need to be able to tailor to individual projects, so it's the default to go to what's in the law. but you need to have confidence in each other, and that's why this idea of starting with the everyday, not with the big controversial project, build that trust. Thought maybe some of you might want to react to that component.
Susan, would it make sense? Would it make sense on complex projects to have a process of convening of stakeholders before a decision's been made about the final course of action, to discuss what the options are to meet the needs that the project's designed to meet, but then also to identify the major environmental considerations that have to be. Wouldn't that make sense?
Absolutely. For example, Louisville River Bridges, an EIS disaster if there ever was one. Do we do 2 EISs, one for each bridge? Do we do a combined EIS? That went through back and forth for something that shouldn't have even, that was a basic starter decision that should have been made and stuck with so that there was confidence for going forward.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I touched on the OECD too. I think, and RPA is actually a good position. By the way, tremendous loss in the region with Ron Kirby, if those who remember. But if you brought Ron, is just one of the greatest, most amazing people in transportation ever. Passed away a few weeks ago. If you put Ron Kirby in charge of kind of what the right thing to do was in the region, Ron had respect from all sides. RPA has that respect from all sides, and what you see is this deference in other countries to those kinds of decisions. And so, it's not like the developer agency, who's the lead agency in the U.S., who obviously has a bias. And let's be honest, they've made some bad decisions, a lot of these developer agencies in the past, and so this distrust is right. I do think in other countries, though, kind of what comes out of the pipeline of the planning process as priorities from an economic perspective, balancing the impacts, receives huge deference, and it just doesn't receive that as much. RPA is an exception, candidly, but across the U.S., that deference is not given, and so as a result, the other agencies get loaded for bear. They're like, that's great, you're pushing your agenda, I'm going to push my agenda. Let's go fight about it.
Yep, please. And if you could name an assignment.
More questions.
Yep.
Yes, Don Elliott, Yale Law School in Covington and Burling. Philip mentioned earlier some of Common Good's work in the medical treatment area, and one of the key drivers there is this idea of defensive medicine, additional costs to do things because of the fear of malpractice.
5 minutes.
I'm wondering if there's something analogous in the in the environmental review area. I think the threats of litigation were mentioned. To what extent is the process delayed beyond what it would take to make a decision because of the threat of judicial review by people who are basically or interests that are just opposed to the project? One of the senior officials at EPA, Mike Shapiro, said, and I've frequently quoted this in work, that EPA analysis of regulatory decisions, about 10% of it is designed to make the decision, and 90% of it is necessary to build a record for judicial review. I'm wondering if we have something like that in this field going on. People have been talking about the decision-making process, and I just wonder whether or not there's an equivalent of defensive medicine in the environmental review area.
Comments from the panel?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation in parallel, because it's absolutely paralyzing. And not only is there the fear of judicial review, but most of the people who are engaged in preparing and managing environmental impact statements aren't lawyers. The lawyers get involved at the end during legal sufficiency review, right? So you have a whole lot of people without appropriate training trying to apply what they think might be a problem from a legal scenario, and they're all trying to do a good job, but it's not their training. And I would say most of the protracted processes and documentations really do result from people trying not to make a mistake. And granted, in these projects, there are a million opportunities every day for people to make mistakes. So, I mean, it's a pretty stressful situation for the people who are doing the environmental reviews. So, if we could provide them with some relief from being wrong, and that's what I think is interesting about some of these states assuming responsibility for an environmental review, because when a federal person is doing an environmental review, their purpose is to check and make sure that it's all been done properly. Once the function goes and lives at the state level, the measurement of performance is whether or not you got the project done, not whether or not you checked the project properly. So that gives a whole different set of management and behaviors than what you would find in a process where you have a third-party federal review.
Hey, there are a lot of really stupid infrastructure projects that ought to be killed, and this is really it's a crazy way to kill them, though. I mean, it's just and there are things that ought to be killed through a political process. Just a brief anecdote: when I was working for Mike Dukakis, I remember I was in environmental affairs, and the state DOT came in with a proposed rerouting of Route 44 in southeastern Massachusetts that managed to hit the state forest, a pond that had 80% of the global population of white-bracted boneset, a globally rare species that the Pilgrims used, the Indians used to set bones. Okay, it's the argument for endangered species. And here's the best one: it hit the property. It was the Sisters of Divine Providence, which was and so how did I kill this thing? Well, I could have gone through the EIS and done that, but instead, I called my friend in the archdiocese in the Cardinal's office, and I told my staff, I said, so set your watches, and basically half an hour, I just want to set your watches, because half an hour from now I'm going to get a call from the state highway commissioner, who's going to say, what the heck did you do to me? And that's exactly what happened. This guy spoke to the cardinal called the governor screamed at the commissioner, project was dead. And we avoided what could have been a 3-year-long EIS process and years of litigation and bullshit and so forth. So but we're using, I think what we're seeing in a lot of these things, or the dock on the Columbia River, another example, we're trying to use a process that was designed to simply put information out there, make it available to people who would then, in theory, make enlightened decisions about how to proceed with a project. And instead, we're trying to make global policy decisions about projects, good and bad and ugly, and in the absence of any effective strategic planning at national, state, local level, which is what it's really the tail wagging the dog here. And I think one of the things takeaways for me is that and we're having this conversation with your successors at DOT. We really need as a national transportation plan with a map and with a set of priorities established, and and that's a conversation that the Senate and the House can sink their teeth into, because that's what they do for a living. Yeah, right back here. Yes, sir.
So, Darren Lovas with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Tyler, first of all, with the executive order you mentioned, I still remember vividly when this came out, and I was one of the first people quoted in the press bashing Mineta, bashing Bush. For coming out with this executive order that was going to have all these disastrous consequences. And I admit candidly now that I was wrong. A big part of the problem here, at least in the transportation arena, and that's where my expertise lies, is that you have these big ticket projects that get held up that are sort of the problem children and that need to be dealt with. And it makes sense to have kind of a SWAT team of federal officials come in and try to address whether or not a decision is thumbs up, thumbs down, rescoping, whatever, come to resolution as quickly as possible with those problems. That's a good idea policy-wise. It's also a good idea politically, because this whole debate tends to be driven by anecdotes and horror stories and specific instances that may not be representative of what's happening statistically overall. And that's really strange right now in the era of so-called big data, when we should be able to do a lot better than that with policy. So that executive order was a good idea. I'm wondering what else can be done administratively. I know that Victor Mendes has everyday counts. What effect has that had? Is that a good idea? So what other progress can be made administratively? And then on the anecdotal issue, how do we move beyond anecdotes in this space? So we really are tracking, and maybe it's through the dashboard, what's happening with average review times for EISs, EAs, CEs, and what kind of progress is being made to reduce those over time. Because I think that's what matters. The outliers are important, sure, and they're attention grabbing, sure, but they're outliers. What's happening with the average review time, right? And then the last question is, how can we front load this? And a couple people mentioned this. Planning should be really more NEPA-like, frankly, at least in transportation. It should be more rigorous. It should be something that's more open to the public. Scenarios should be more detailed. And I say this actually having been briefed last night on a new project judging process that the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in San Francisco has established, where they actually are able to monetize benefit costs for projects in their 20-year long-range plan and stack them up against one another and then go to sponsors and say, guess what, you don't measure up, you need to rescope, or you need to drop your project, or we need to come to some other settlement about what to do about your project. And that's in the 20-year plan. That's not at the delivery or development stage. So that's remarkable. How do we improve planning so that we really take projects seriously, you know, in that level of detail? I think that's beyond anything even that New York is doing. I mean, it was remarkable to have MTC show us this tool that they've developed. And why can't other regions do the same kind of thing and make the public aware of it? So those are three big questions. What can be done administratively? How do we move from anecdotes to statistics? And how do we open up the planning so that we actually have fewer problems at the end of the pipeline in terms of project delivery, because projects get improved earlier on and the public is more aware of them and there are fewer surprises. So you have less chance of litigation or controversy later on. So sorry, that's a lot to pack in, but.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, one thing I'd say is that we're happy to welcome you to our planning committee on coming up with proposals for changing the administrative process to accomplish all this. My background is I'm a civic leader. So I and a handful of people at an organization called the Municipal Arts Society spent basically 30 years, since I was a young lawyer, fighting the stupidest ideas that City Hall ever came up with. You know, tear up Grand Central Terminal, get rid of the lights on Times Square, build a tower on Columbus Circle that would cast a shadow to the Metropolitan Museum. I mean, just incredibly one after another, idiotic proposals that came out of City Hall, and one way or another, we figured out how to raise the public hires, local, and stop them. So you can get a lot of stupid decisions out of government, which tends to be insulated and not listening to the audience around it. So that just underscores what you said. We need to have a transparent process and have this more directed toward planning, leaving aside the big policy stuff, which should be somewhere else, but towards the planning of projects rather than what it is now, which is a justification. It's just what Don Elliott said. It's just a defensive exercise in justification, not really trying to make the project better. One idea that hasn't come up that I'm going to raise, that I write about in this new book, is other countries have independent commissions that have official status but no power. And they appoint people. Germany has a regulatory control council. All new laws have to go through this council, which issues a report on it. It has no power to stop the law, but it's generally retired, respected officials, and they write a report on what they think of the law. Well, there's no moral authority in this area right now. As Susan was saying, nobody trusts anyone. So it would be useful to have a moral authority, and the environmental groups, I don't think, have it at the moment because they tend to be the naysayers, even though they're trying to help the environment. So maybe another sort of tool to throw in this kit when we're trying to come up with something is to institutionalize a form of an independent moral authority that would actually start give reports on something about what makes sense and what doesn't and such. And that would shift the debate from the typical polarized, I'm for it, I'm against it, to, well, to things more approaching balance.
I think we probably need to wrap up this panel. We've got another one coming on. I think we're almost back on schedule. A couple of thoughts. One is that, some of the big ideas coming out of this conversation. First, to have, some kind of process to evaluate projects before they get into the EIS process, to make them better or to kill them, and whether it's an independent panel. I see this image of these guys with black hoods over their heads and so forth. It'd be very impressive. The Moral Authority Commission.
He said that is retired respected. Is that I didn't know anybody in the U.S. could retire with respect anymore. So
well, I think they can't have been indicted. I think that's the important thing, and so which would
We're not indicted yet.
Or in Albany, that would disqualify virtually everybody. But it's the notion of doing some strategic planning at the federal agency and state level, so that we deal with the bigger, policy and investment decisions at that scale, as opposed to trying to use this imperfect process to make big policy decisions about global issues. Having somebody in charge, at the lead agency, whatever the federal lead agency is, and then with the proponent, having deadlines, having building schedules. And I think you could do this by regulation. I think you could do it by expectation, just saying we're creating a critical path of 1 year. This thing is going to be done, and have some serious people, whether it's the Secretary of Transportation or the Governor of New York or whoever it is, saying this is the deal. We're going to do this. Opening up the process, both for planning and then I think for, before anything goes into the EIS process, convening stakeholders to have a conversation about the project, the timeline, the issues that are going to be addressed and so forth, and then using that process to firm up some of the things that are not quite right about projects, and maybe to kick out some projects that the governor could just say, look, this is a hornet's nest, I'm not going to do this. And I think getting the scoping right, big part of what worked on the Tappan Zee, for example, was that in previous efforts they'd been looking at a 33-mile long section of Route 287 and trying to fix all of that, and instead we scoped it down to, it's a bridge. Let's get the bridge right, and then we can fix the other stuff later on, and we'll create a process for doing that. And then giving the politicians and the agency people cover to do that. I think I've covered most of it, and I think having a tracking process that's public and transparent, so that people can see how these projects are doing, and there's public disclosure about that, and then there's an assessment of whether we're getting any better, whether it's the state or federal level. I think the final thing is, and we learned this from the international examples of wherever appropriate, delegating these responsibilities to the states. Which again, if it's, and it may be that the Savannah River, where it's an interstate river, that there's going to be a federal role. It's the nature of federalism that the feds have got to be involved in, and so forth. But in but get the approval process close to the people who are going to pay for and benefit from the project. Seems to me that makes sense. At any rate, we're going to be inviting, we've got another panel. There will be a report coming out of this whole process, which will go out to all of you. We'll try to discern, there'll be a committee established to work with us to pull together some recommendations, and there'll be a follow-up panel in a few months to discuss, some draft recommendations. So plenty of opportunities for everybody in the room to weigh in on this thing. And by the way, the only thing I think we bring to this is a little moral authority, right? That we have no authority to do any of this. So it's
we not only have zero authority, but we're also we have no idea what to do. So we are really planning it with you. This is the proper way that planning should happen, which is clueless people ask other people.
Speak for yourself.
That's exactly.
Right. There we go.
So what should happen? Why don't we, the other panel's going to come up. Why don't we take a 5-minute break and then...
Let's thank this panel. Thank you. Good discussion.
That was great.
Thank you.
That's great.
My pleasure.